Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, August 27th, Tuesday 2, or Tuesday B, as we call it here, since Donald Trump, who is actually dead, nuked Monday because, well, he don't like Mondays, and that's all there is to it. So here you are. And the rest of the show is just me and the Swedish chef. Okay, it's time for another show. Daily Co's Radio is live now, I am told reliably by Bill in Portland, Maine, wherein Kagro X, that's me, may take a moment today to explore the Trump doctrine, which states that other options should be considered only if a nuclear detonation doesn't fix the problem first. Or he'll just spend 2 hours chanting USA, USA. It's a difficult task all by itself, but I have a nice tall glass of water here, and I think I can probably get the job done. We'll see which one works best. I do read this morning that Brazil has rejected the $20 million offer for help from, I guess, the international community as represented by the G7. There are more countries than just us seven, and one of the seven isn't even a country. It's the EU, so I don't know what to tell you. But I don't know. I guess they don't have to take what we have on offer, I suppose. Of course, we could just bomb them with water, or water balloons might even work very well, too. It's still summer. A lot of kids aren't necessarily back in school yet. We could just have a water fight and see if that changes anything. Well, let's see. Plenty of other options out there, of course. I think maybe they're holding out for more money. That could be a possibility. The internet this morning is abuzz with stories about bed bugs, or at least with tweets about bed bugs. As I understand it, there's an actual article out there that explains what happened here. But I don't know. Does everybody already know the story? It goes something like this. I know I have somewhere a Washington Post story on the subject. Let me comb through the tweets this morning to make sure. I had retweeted it along with my own explanation of what was going on here. But the Washington Post is covering the story. Of course, the story happened at the New York Times. I'm sure the New York Times has something about this somewhere. But we'll put a little distance in it and use the Washington Post story. A professor, this is the headline, called Brett Stevens a bedbug. The New York Times columnist complained to his boss. I don't really know why I'm spending time on this. So I should be, my television says I should be spending time talking about Taylor Swift, I think. All day, all weekend, it was telling me that Taylor Swift was going to be performing at the Video Music Awards. Not something I ordinarily would pay attention to, but there were a lot of commercials. And you can't just ignore commercials, you know. You have to pay attention to them and do what they say. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. But now I find out this morning, only tangentially, because I really didn't see that many. My Twitter feed doesn't have that much in it. But apparently, she made all the conservatives angry by saying something relatively political, or maybe even explicitly political. And you know how they hate that. Taylor Swift used to be something of an alt-right icon, too, by the way. Not because of anything she said or did, but because right-wing, alt-right incel weirdos thought she was attractive and thought that she was very Aryan-looking because of how white she was, and didn't have anything to do with things that she did or said or sang, and not that that matters. To alt-right incels, of course, you know, is that someone I would like to club over the head and drag to my cave? Then I'm attracted to them. Doesn't make any difference whether she likes it or not, or whether she really did anything. Anyway, I'll see if we can find out what's happening about that story later on. In the meantime, the bedbug story, very important. Everyone's talking about it. Tim Elfrink, really? That's the name of the reporter on this Washington Post. Elfrink. Is that like the junior league hockey venue? The tweet seemed harmless enough to David Karpf. And David Karpf, I found out, well, I'll tell you later. Anyway, the tweet seemed harmless enough to David Karpf. He's the professor in all this. An associate professor of media and public affairs at George Washington University took a story that bedbugs had infested the New York Times newsroom as an occasion to dig at his least favorite Times writer, the conservative columnist Bret Stephens. The bedbugs, in case you were wondering, are a metaphor. Karpf wrote on Monday, "The bedbugs are Bret Stephens." The tweet got 9 total likes and 0 retweets, Karpf said. Sorry about that. So the professor was surprised when an email from Stephens himself popped up a few hours later. It says popped in, but I spiced things up by saying up instead. Then he noticed his provost at GWU was copied on the email, and Stephens was furious. And here's the quote from the letter here. "I'm often amazed about the things supposedly decent people are prepared to say about other people they've never met, on Twitter. I think you've set a new standard." I don't think so. Stephens wrote, congratulations to you, David, if you did. But I think you probably don't think you set a new standard here either. And it's not something you want to do anyway in this case. Anyhow, I would welcome the opportunity for you to come to my home, meet my wife and kids, talk to us for a few minutes, and then call me a bedbug to my face. All right. That would take some genuine courage and intellectual integrity on your part. That's interesting that you would think that was intellectual integrity. But I guess I'll go for it. I don't know. Anyway, here's embedded in this is Dave Karpf's further tweets about it, and including the email itself and him explaining what's going on and all this. The exchange quickly went viral after Karpf posted Stephens' full email on Twitter, leading to waves of backlash against the columnist whose contrarian takes on climate change and race have prompted canceled subscriptions and pointed questions for his editors in the past. Well, it sounds like he causes more trouble than he's worth, one might deduce. The professor said Stephens' decision to email his superior at GWU with his complaints was an inappropriate attack from a writer with one of the highest profile platforms in journalism. Yeah, I think so. He not only thinks I should be ashamed of what I wrote, he thinks I should also get in trouble for it, Karpf told the Washington Post. That's an abuse of his power. And blah, 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 freedom of speech, something. Anyway, in an email, Stephens told the Post that his email to Karpf speaks for itself. He loves emailing, Stephens does. A spokesperson for the Times didn't immediately respond to a message about the exchange. Stephens has courted controversy. Dun, dun, dun. I think we have that somewhere, right? There we go. He's courted controversy since joining the Times in 2017 after working as a deputy editorial page editor at the Wall Street Journal, where he won a Pulitzer Prize. Ta-da! I wish we had something about that. His first column, which critics labeled climate change denialism, led some notable climate scientists to cancel their Times subscriptions in protest. Others took him to task for his past work at the Journal, where he called the campus rape epidemic an imaginary enemy and suggested anti-Semitism was the disease of the Arab mind, as the Post's Ruth Marcus reported. He's also been known to hit back hard at critics, as when he penned a lengthy email to a Deadspin writer who had slammed his work, a response also posted in full on the web. Karpf has said he found Stephens' research wanting, particularly in his columns on climate change, a subject the professor is well acquainted with as a former Sierra Club board member and longtime activist. So, when he read on Monday that bedbugs had been found in the second, third, and fourth floors of the Times newsrooms, he couldn't resist poking fun at Stephens. He tends to write pretty lightweight, poorly researched columns about things that I know something about, Karpf said. So, I've always seen him as this person that everyone complains about, but we just can't get rid of. He's a bedbug. I get it. Anyway, Karpf sent out his tweet just after 5 p.m. thinking it was a subtle but funny joke. He decided against tagging Stephens, worrying that might be rude, he said, so it's not clear how it caught the columnist's attention. In his email, Stephens said that, quote, someone just pointed out a tweet you wrote about me, but the tweet had gotten so little engagement that Karpf was baffled he'd seen it. You need to work very hard to find a tweet that obscure, and then work harder to find the writer's email and their provost's email to CC them too, he said. Good point. If Stephens hadn't included his boss on the email, the tenured professor said, he would have been happy to talk. I would have treated this as an opportunity for conversation and dialogue if he hadn't CC'd my provost, he said, which was clearly an attempt to threaten me with punishment. Karpf said he'd still be willing to chat with Stevens, assuming his offer was legitimate. I'd be happy to have the dialogue, not just about the tenor of Twitter comments, but also about power and how to appropriately use it, he said. But I assume he won't want to talk, so he ought to be embarrassed. But the exchange wasn't a total waste for Karpf. I teach strategic political communication, he said, and we will certainly be talking about this case in my class on Wednesday. That's not now. It's currently Tuesday, which means he's probably free to, I don't know, he's busy, I'm sure. Probably free, though, to think about other ways to annoy Bret Stephens. Great reactions out there include our own Daily Kost's Hunter, I thought, a good one, who, let's see, where did his tweet go to? But he basically said, maybe the science is still out on that. Bret Stephens says he's not a bed bug, but what proof do we really have? And he took the metaphor even further than just that. Let's see, where is his thread here? Yeah, New York Times columnist Bret Stephens says he's not a bed bug. I say the science is still unclear. Sure, Bret Stephens may find 97 bedbug scientists who agree he is not a bedbug, but I can find a civil engineer and 2 think tank pundits to claim those 97 experts are stupid and have been getting bedbug identification wrong for years. You get the point. All right. So you see where I'm going with this. And, of course, I also waded into it. I don't really care either way about Bret Stephens that much. I'm with everybody else in finding him annoying, but I just don't read his columns. But you're all correct. But I thought that the proper headline for this at the New York Times should be Karpf urges unity. But then I may be wrong about that. I'm not certain I nailed it on that one. Anyway, so there we are. And as it turns out, you don't have to, I guess Professor Karpf didn't have to work that hard to find my tweet about it. As it turns out, he's a follower on Twitter, so it was easy enough to catch his attention with that. I don't think I fixed the situation, but we had some fun with it, and that's the next best thing, I think. Okay. Many other subjects to cover today. I didn't find anything out yet about Taylor Swift. I might try that during the break, but you might not care, so maybe not. Okay. Let's see. Other issues looming for discussion today. There are several. But just before airtime, like literally seconds, as the music was playing, I think, I caught sight of a tweeted New York Times story that sounded intriguing, and I don't know whether it's going to be directly relevant. It has some players involved who are directly relevant to stories we've had to cover because they're major issues. But I think this story itself is a little bit off our beaten path, but not out of keeping with things we've sometimes decided to grant some time to. This is an interesting one. New York Times piece from yesterday, the title of which is Trial of High-Powered Lawyer Gregory Craig Exposes Seamy Side of Washington's Elite. It sounded kind of intriguing all by itself, but it was the players involved that got me interested at first, and then some of the snippets that were being tweeted around made me think, there's something here for us. Now, Gregory Craig is, for those of you that didn't recognize the name immediately, a former White House counsel from the Obama administration. And the fact that he's on trial of some sort, the trial of high-powered lawyer Gregory Craig, I don't remember offhand what's going on here, and maybe my memory will be refreshed by reading the story, but there were other aspects of the story that I found really very interesting. So let's just jump in here. Sharon Lafreniere has my best stab at the name of the author of the piece here. It's a trial tailor-made to grab the attention of this city's power brokers. I am not, first of all, a denizen of that city. I'm nearby, but I don't live in Washington, D.C., and I'm not a power broker. But it nonetheless grabbed my attention because I'm sometimes interested in what grabs the attention of actual power brokers. We can learn from that occasionally. But anyway, this is a former White House counsel, Craig, and attorney to global statesmen and other icons, and he's battling criminal charges of lying to investigators about his work for a shady foreign client. That's like dramatic music worthy, or maybe even horror dramatic. That is my feeling, anyway. I mean, you hate to see it. Right? You know, this is normally what was attention grabbing about this, and which later becomes part of the story, is that work for shady foreign clients has lately been in the news more prominently because there are Republican lawyers attached to it. But it is one of those things people like to point out both sides do engage in. And it's also one of those things that gets papered over a lot because everybody deserves a defense, and you know, you can't blame attorneys for practicing their craft, and everybody needs a defense and blah 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 and zealous advocacy. But that doesn't always ring true with shady foreign clients, depending on what it is they're trying to do. But okay. I will allow for mixed feelings here. But the most riveting aspect, says the story itself, the most riveting aspect of the case against the lawyer, Gregory B. Craig, is not his innocence or guilt. So forget all that. That's stupid. Rather, it is the depiction of the seamy world of power brokers like Mr. Craig that prosecutors have painted during nearly 2 weeks of testimony and in an array of court filings. It is beginning to sound interesting, and began to kind of make me think a little bit of the college admissions scandal, which I guess now the college admissions season is over, has died down in interest for people. By the way, as we continue on here, Karen was commenting here. Interesting that Trump has said nothing about Gregory Craig, nothing in support nor anything maliciously aimed at Obama. That's true. This is it's not probably on Fox News, and he's been away. Trump's back from France, by the way, and I don't know. So he's probably asleep or tweeting about whatever he sees on television. As soon as Fox gets around to making news about it, then he'll pick up on it. Or as you'll see, I think what I was able to glean from a quick glance at the story, it may be that it involves other parties more closely connected to him, and so he's hands off for the moment. All right. So the most riveting aspect of the case, then, is the depiction of the seamy world of power brokers like Mr. Craig that has come out at the trial. Mr. Craig's trial has supplanted any image of Washington's elite as sage Brahmins with a vivid picture of the ruling class at its avaricious worst. Raise your hand, by the way, if you ever had an image of Washington's elite as sage Brahmins. But I get the point. There was a time when people either did that or liked to think that they did that or whatever. The details include a $4 million payment shunted through a secret offshore account to Mr. Craig's law firm, a backdated invoice, a lying publicist, a scheme to net one player's daughter a cushy job, and a bungled wiretap by a suspected Russian intelligence asset nicknamed the Angry Midget. It's not my fault. I didn't make up the name. Please don't, you can write me angry stories about that if you really want to. I think that would be fun. Anyway, that's a quote, the Angry Midget. And, wow, I mean, the only thing that separates this from the normal stories about the seamy underside of Washington is that the scheme was to net one player's daughter a job as opposed to simply netting one player's daughter, period. So, things are looking up. Taken together, they illustrate how lawyers, lobbyists, and public relations specialists leapt onto slippery ethical slopes to cash in on a foreign government's hope of papering over its sordid reputation. This is getting better. 7 years ago, Mr. Craig teamed with Paul Manafort. Aha, I knew there was something interesting here, right? And that's the real problem here. You team with Paul Manafort, you will eventually find yourself on trial. And, this should surprise no one. Okay, so 7 years ago, Craig teamed with Paul Manafort, then a political consultant for the Ukrainian government, to help President Viktor F. Yanukovych respond to criticism over a prosecution of Ukraine's opposition leader. Mr. Craig's law firm collected more than $4.6 million to produce a report concluding that while the trial was flawed by Western standards, the conviction was supported by evidence. Like, to what end? I mean, that's just a PR operation, obviously, but, like, get a PR firm, not a law firm. But you know, if it's a legal case, you want to review it and say, how would it compare to a Western trial? I get the point, but what a stretch. Anyway, for Mr. Craig and his law firm, Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, mostly known around town just as Skadden Arps, getting too close to Mr. Yanukovych's corrupt and increasingly authoritarian government posed perils, chiefly the prospect of tainting its prestigious white shoe law practice. Skadden Arps gets itself in trouble all the time anyway, just because of the nature of Washington business, but they usually survive it. But this time, Ukrainian government posed a real threat. Okay. Mr. Craig, now 74, faced an even more direct problem. If he went beyond producing the report to promoting it to journalists or others, he could run afoul of the decades-old federal law that requires those who represent foreign powers in the United States to disclose their actions to the Justice Department. And in fact, he'd become a lobbyist for the Ukrainian government, not simply an analyst of their legal system for pay, which is, look, if you're taking Ukrainian money, people will find things if they look at your exchange, because Ukrainian money from the top doesn't often come with clean hands. It's not that it's impossible. It's just you want to be careful. Those worries faded after Skadden's report was published in 2012. But then prosecutors began to draw back the curtain on the project, described by one publicist for Ukraine as a loony job for a government seeking to bolster a terrible reputation. The next section of this article is entitled A $4 Million Gift. Aha. Remember, they netted $4 million in payments for this. The saga began in February 2012 when Douglas E. Schoen, a high-profile Democratic pollster, and not well-liked here, contacted Mr. Craig, also a high-profile Democratic person. I don't know what you would call him, but having been White House counsel for Obama, I suppose. Certainly high-profile, Democratic, and then I ran out of words. So he contacted Mr. Craig to discuss a, quote, potentially substantial piece of new business, an independent review of the prosecution and imprisonment of Yulia V. Tymoshenko. I think we remember who that is. Ukraine's charismatic former prime minister and Mr. Yanukovych's political rival. I think she had I remember her most as the world leader who had this very dramatic braided hairstyle, and in the chaos of what was going on in Ukraine at the time, I don't know. I guess she stood out in photos. Those are really kind of, it wasn't like it was a bizarre hairstyle or anything. It's just not what you're used to seeing on the world stage among prime ministers. But then we don't pay much attention to what the European prime ministers are doing at all on the show. Certainly not reviewing the visual record of it. Anyway, that's how I remember her. And she was charismatic as well. So, that's like a normal thing to be if you're prime minister, right? This account is based on witness statements, court filings, and evidence presented at Mr. Craig's trial, now nearing its conclusion. The Ukrainian government was the client, but Viktor Pinchuk, a Ukrainian steel magnate, represented by Mr. Schoen, was footing the bill. Why? Already you're in trouble, right? When Ukraine has to pay for something like this, Rick Gates, Mr. Manafort's longtime deputy, told one associate, the president asks whichever oligarch whose turn it is to cover the costs. And that's why it's so often difficult to get away with taking money from the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych cleanly. The main contact between Mr. Craig and the Ukrainian government was Mr. Manafort, which is also a problem, who had become anyway, fabulously rich working for Mr. Yanukovych and was hiding his income in offshore bank accounts. Later, after Mr. Manafort served as Donald J. Trump's campaign chairman, I love that they have to include the middle initial, the special counsel investigated his financial misdeeds and brought a pair of cases that netted a 7-year prison term for Mr. Manafort. And then, of course, would, in a ripple effect, cause problems for everyone else who did business with this guy, because he got a check, right? Everyone else's names turns up in the files now. Despite misgivings by some Skadden lawyers, Mr. Craig flew to Ukraine's capital, Kiev, to seal the deal over breakfast at Mr. Pinchuk's palatial home. There's $4 million in it. It's worth a flight, right? He and Mr. Manafort agreed privately that Mr. Pinchuk would pay Skadden $4 million to produce a report that Mr. Yanukovych hoped would convince Western governments that Ukraine should be allowed to join the European Union and partake of its financial benefits. So there's a lot of money at stake for everybody. For the Ukraine, for Skadden Arps and their partners and their high-flying, jet-setting lifestyle and the private schools that their kids go to, and the colleges they may have to buy their way into, or even if they don't buy their way into it, that they'll have to pay tuition at, country clubs, all sorts of things that demand money, and Skadden Arps partners are used to getting it. And $4 million split among them is a drop in the bucket, but everyone likes to fill their bucket. And so they were interested in having him sign, I guess. Mr. Craig had already dispatched 5 lawyers to Kiev when Mr. Pinchuk notified him that Mr. Yanukovych's office had not authorized him to wire the half of the money that was due up front. Mr. Craig was furious and threatened to quit. And yet he didn't. I'm not certain why, but perhaps we'll find out more about it on the other side of this 2-minute break, after which we'll continue with this story and maybe later learn to regret it. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with reading about the trial of high-powered lawyer Gregory Craig and how it exposed the seamy side of Washington's elite, and Kiev's, I guess, as well. We will leave tomorrow, he is threatening. Now, remember, we're talking about Greg Craig, former White House counsel to Barack Obama. He is engaged in trying to sign on one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, Pinchuk, to pay, as he's a victor too, I think, right? To pay for the legal analysis to be done on behalf of the Yanukovych government about its trial and imprisonment of the former prime minister. What was her name again? Okay. Well, let me scroll all the way back here and see if I can't fill in the blanks there on this one. Where did it go? Okay. Well, at any rate, it's in here somewhere. It's, what was it? Timoshenko. That's it. Okay. So, the Yanukovych government is looking to get a Western legal team to validate the outcome of a flawed trial of former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, now in prison under the Yanukovych government. And one of Yanukovych's favorite oligarchs, Pinchuk, is offering to pay $4 million to Skadden Arps to allow Greg Craig to land this client, $4 million to produce this study. But at this point, Craig is on his way, or what do we say? Despite some misgivings, Craig flies to Ukraine's capital to seal the deal. However, he had already dispatched 5 lawyers to Kiev when Pinchuk notified him that Yanukovych's office hadn't authorized him, the oligarch, to wire half the money that was due up front. Craig's mad. He wants the money. His partners are angry. They need to pay their private school bills for their kids and lawn maintenance and country club memberships, etc. Where's the money? And so he says, "We will leave tomorrow. Go home and say that we are lucky to be out of it," he wrote to Mr. Manafort, who got him into this, who promised to deliver the money a different way. Manafort did. Why was Manafort interested in seeing Greg Craig paid? Because he was interested in seeing Skadden Arps, for whatever reason, take on the case on behalf of Yanukovych. It could be because he wanted to help the Yanukovych government because that's where his money was coming from. It could be that he desperately wanted to have people from, quote, the other side of the aisle entangled in his mess because he knew it was shady, but that if it involved Democrats, then it wouldn't be a partisan political point-scoring exercise for Democrats to root out Republican corruption later. That could be part of it. We don't know. But the Ukrainian government planned to capitalize on Mr. Craig's luminous reputation. Best known as the White House counsel during the first year of the Obama administration, he had represented luminaries including Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General, and Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Ukraine's Ministry of Justice noted in a statement announcing the inquiry. But Skadden's fancy reputation cut the other way, too. Publicly, Ukraine's financially strapped government said the firm would be paid only the legal limit for outside contractors, $12,000. Ah, okay. And they weren't going to do this job for $12,000, although they could have done it as a pro bono type thing, right? Or even for $12,000. We'll help out a foreign government because, probably nothing horrible is going to happen and it'll look good on our PR materials. Right? We represent foreign governments. When entire countries need legal representation, they come to Skadden Arps, right? Anyway, in an August 2012 editorial with the headline "Skadden Stink," the Kiev Post called that assertion ridiculous, that the firm would only be paid $12,000, noting that would cover only about 12 hours of Mr. Craig's services alone at his standard rate. Ms. Timoshenko's lawyer refused to cooperate with the project unless Skadden disclosed more information. In other words, no one believed that they were doing this for $12,000 for the exposure, etc., like people used to be paid for an exposure for writing for various prominent national blogs, etc., right? Well, it wasn't going to work. And Timoshenko said, look, we're not going to make ourselves available. And it's really hard to believe they would anyway. I mean, why legitimize your own imprisonment? But I guess they saw some value in it. But Timoshenko's lawyer refused to cooperate with the project unless they got to the reality of it. How much are you really being paid to do this, so that we get a clear picture of what you're being asked to do here? Scrambling, Mr. Craig and Mr. Manafort agreed to raise the official fee to $1.25 million. Bypassing his own firm's billing system, Mr. Craig submitted a new invoice for that amount, although the firm had already collected more than 3 times that sum from Mr. Pinchuk, routed through offshore bank accounts controlled by Mr. Manafort. You're already in trouble, right? At Mr. Manafort's request, Mr. Craig backdated the document to before the newspaper editorial was published. Fearing more bad publicity, he also delayed work on a follow-up project involving a second trial of Ms. Timoshenko. Wow. So what's going on here is the Ukraine's, pardon me, why do I keep adding the article, Ukraine, I guess now that it's back to independent country status, it's no longer the Ukraine, like it's a province of some kind. But Ukraine's financially strapped government wants everyone to believe, for whatever reason, that they're only paying $12,000 for this work because that's the legal limit on outside contracts because they're so cash-strapped. Skadden Arps is never going to do it for that amount of money. Nobody believes it. So in response to that, Craig and Manafort agree to raise, to pretend that the fee is actually $1.25 million, even though Skadden had already collected, it says, more than 3 times that amount. So that would be $3.75 million somehow, even though just a moment ago we were told that they couldn't get half of the money paid up front. But at some, I guess, later point, they had collected more than 3/4 of the money. But in addition to all this, they have to do it this way. Well, we'll pretend that we're only charging them $1.25 million. We've already received more than $3.75 million. So we need to start hiding the money in order to make it, in order to hide the fact that we're lying about how much we're charging. Let's route it through offshore bank accounts. In fact, let's not only route it through offshore bank accounts, let's route it through offshore bank accounts controlled by Paul Manafort, who at that time, it was not widely publicly known exactly how corrupt he was, although most of Washington knew or suspected exactly that. But it hadn't been declared illegal yet, and he wasn't working for Donald Trump as far as we could tell at that point, and Donald Trump was still a joke around that time. But in addition to all of that, they also backdated the paperwork so that it wouldn't look like they had changed their billing based on this Skadden stink editorial in the Kiev Post. All right, next section, trade-offs and phone taps. The fees were not Mr. Craig's only problem. And this was the part, I think, that caught my attention. It was the part that was screen grabbed and tweeted around with the tweet that caught my eye. The fees were not Mr. Craig's only problem. He also had to placate Mr. Manafort. Why? Manafort wanted Skadden to hire his daughter, Andrea Manafort. She may say Andrea, I have no idea. A recent law school graduate. Well, that would be a prime placement. You just graduated from law school and you get a job with Skadden Arps. I mean, it happens usually for elite graduates who've clerked for Supreme Court judges, justices, or circuit court judges who went to elite law schools. I don't know whether that's the case with her or not. It may be. Manafort was apparently capable of bribing lots of people into lots of things. But there you have it. A side item in the deal is Skadden has to hire my daughter, Andrea, who I guess was one of the 2 daughters involved in the leaked text conversations about her father's horrific behavior in his marriage. So that's pretty interesting, too. And I don't remember which of the 2 daughters, I don't know whether he has more than 2 daughters, or and I don't remember the names of the 2 involved in the exchange, but it was pretty interesting. And one of them was flatly furious with their father, and the other was a little more, I don't know what. She was basically just caught in the middle of the whole thing and had a difficult time accepting what her sister was telling her about her father, I think. I don't know which one this is, but it would be interesting to, I also don't know the chronology here. Have they had this text conversation yet? If this is 2012, they might not have. But surely they had probably some suspicions about their dad and the relationship with the mom. If it ever got to the point that those text conversations if they were reflective of reality, surely they had some suspicions at that point. But maybe Andrea thought she could get past it all if her dad's connections landed her a job at Skadden, which might tell us a little bit about the sincerity of that later text conversation, too. We'll see how this comes out. Anyway, when Mr. Craig sought interviews for her, Skadden sent her a standard rejection letter in response to a resume that had arrived with no cover letter. So not even really trying very hard at this stage. Thanks for your help, Mr. Manafort wrote sarcastically in a email to Mr. Craig. So, thanks for your help. is really what he wrote in an email to Mr. Craig, attaching the rejection letter. I see Skadden knows how to show appreciation for a $4 million gift account. Interesting that he would declare it a gift right up front. Just reminding them that, you owe me whatever happened to giving my daughter that job. I mean, put a cover letter on the goddamn thing there, Paul. Jeez. I mean, give us some ability to fudge this for you, if you don't mind. Anyway, that's pretty crazy. Let's see. By the way, I'm going to just Google her up here. Andrea Manafort. Look at this. Everybody's searching. So I see Andrea Manafort Skadden, Andrea Manafort Law School, Andrea Manafort shared Twitter. Maybe it was, the story was, I thought it was texts with her sister. Yeah, here we go. And this is a more recent piece about it, but I know these went back to 2017, 18. What do we have? Paul Manafort's daughter's texted friend, about something here, and this was in October of 2017. Paul Manafort's daughter texted friends about how tight her dad was with Trump. There's that one. And let's see. That's not the one I was thinking of, though, but there was also, in a series of text messages, Paul Manafort's daughter implicates, this is it here, implicates her father in mass murder. Yeah, that was certainly one of the more surprising ones. This is from the Intellectualist, which I don't know what the heck that actually is. But yeah, Paul Manafort's daughters Andrea and Jessica discuss how their father makes money, and it's very dark. And apparently there's some links here. Business Insider, Politico, and CNN have reported on these texts as well. Who would get the juiciest stuff? Maybe Politico. Let's take a look at what they put on it headline-wise. Manafort's Ukrainian blood money causes qualms, hack suggests. Trump Yanukovych work concerned the family of Trump's former campaign chairman, texts appear to show. But in the meantime, there's also out there Andrea Manafort bragging about how tight Manafort was with Trump. By the way, I guess she's married or was married at some point. Andrea Manafort Shand was the full name that was in use at the time. I don't know what the status of that marriage is. But yeah, as I recall, there was some pretty serious accusations made. 300,000 texts, by the way, hacked and stolen from the mobile phone of Andrea Manafort, the former Trump campaign manager's daughter. Incredibly, Manafort confirmed to Politico that his daughter's mobile phone had been hacked. He corroborated some text exchanges while refusing to comment on others. It's Andrea. There we go. She's the one actually writing these things. Just by way of reminder, and these taken from the Business Insider version of the story. I guessed wrong about who would be most interested in this salacious material. The first of the texts says, quote, "Don't fool yourself." This is Andrea writing to her sister, according to the text. "That money we have is blood money. You know he has killed people in Ukraine knowingly." She continued, according to the reviewed text, "as a tactic to outrage the world and get focus on Ukraine. Remember when there were all those deaths taking place a while back, about a year ago, revolts and whatnot? Do you know whose strategy that was to cause that, to send those people out and get slaughtered?" Now, there's more to it. And then, of course, a lot of it was about the way he treated their mother. And as I recall, the allegations was that he was forcing her into group sex situations. But it's a morning show. Anyway, you probably remember this story already. And it's just a tangent to the story. But it gives some context in case the rest of the New York Times story doesn't. Give some context to who we're talking about here. And in other words, it's not that an entirely innocent exchange there, and not an entirely innocent exchange trying to get her a job either. I'm just sort of curious about this. So when did this happen? When did the hack happen? I'm reading here a 2017 story, but it's not clear the date of the texts that were going on, but it's probably not that. There we are. A March 2015 exchange. So before March of 2015, comes, 2012, during which time Manafort is prevailing on Craig at Skadden Arps to employ his daughter, who's just graduated from law school. So this is 2012. By 2015, she's accusing him of murder, mass murder, and abusing her mother, essentially. So, it's not beyond the pale that it's entirely possible that in 2012 she didn't know, but by 2015 she did. But then again, by 2015 she knows that her father is questionable at best, although I think she says, that he's like a blood-soaked tyrant or something in the middle of all of this. So, what is it? No moral or legal compass. He's a sick effing tyrant. So, and we keep showing up and dancing for him. We just keep showing up and eating lobster. Nothing changes. That by 2015. But in 2012, I don't know. Maybe she didn't ask for help getting a job, and he just assumed that she wanted it. I don't really know. And then, just to point out, I think she runs a little bit hot and cold here, because what's the date on these texts from the HuffPost story? Paul Manafort's daughter texted with friends about how tight her dad was with Trump. That's a story that's published in late October, Halloween, as a matter of fact, 2017. And scanning down a little bit here, the public record shows that Manafort, he joins the campaign, etc. The following texts sent by Manafort Shan to her sister Jessica Manafort and to friends, part of the cache of this website, part of the hack, they turn up. So in 2016, the Manafort daughters claim Trump asked their father to run his campaign. And, and I guess at this point, so 2016 or so, they're back to bragging about how tight their dad is with Trump. So sometimes they're into their dad's shadiness and sometimes they're not. All right. That's some context. Back to the Greg Craig trial story. Manafort in 2012 is saying, hire my daughter. It doesn't work out. Just faxing the resume over there. No cover letter. And Manafort is pissed and says, I see Skadden knows how to show appreciation for a $4 million gift account. I am pissed, Mr. Craig replied. In an email to the firm's Washington head of litigation, Mitchell S. Ettinger, he wrote, this could not have come at a worse time. We want the money. Mr. Manafort told Mr. Craig that he would generate 7-figure annual fees, adding that it goes without saying that I will push all future business to wherever his daughter ended up, because then she would become a partner, and then he would not have to keep helping her because she would just be independently at that point, thanks to his help, able to scoop up huge chunks of partner money, some of which is arranged in exactly this fashion all the time. But rather than handing her this money, he wanted to teach her to be able to grub it herself later on. Okay. And that's part of the story of the seamy underside of all this, too. I don't know if they actually focus on it, but I'll give you that part of the story. So, Mr. Ettinger told Mr. Craig to stress the prospect of further business because that, quote, is the only factor that will matter, unquote, to the firm's leaders. In other words, is she a qualified lawyer? Did she go to a good school? Does she have some experience, maybe some prestigious experience clerking for somebody? I don't know. But the point is, her dad's a big shot and a seamy, part of the seamy underside of Washington and can steer millions of dollars to us. Isn't that what you really want? And, it's not a big departure from the way business is usually done in the white shoe firms either. It is all about the money. It's just that usually the money comes, they like to pretend that the money comes from cleaner clients. Very often it comes from dirty clients. Who else needs that much legal work, right? So, people are innocent until proven guilty, but whatever. People that find themselves in legal trouble a lot means something, right? We would have to investigate on an individual case-by-case basis to find out exactly what it means, but it means something. But yes, that's the world of high high-profile, high-powered law firms and partnerships. People get partnerships, no surprise to anyone, based on the amount of money they're bringing into the firm. It is, after all, a business partnership. Sometimes they'll also say, well, this person is a brilliant attorney and we'll make them a partner because of that. But that's because they say, well, if you have somebody who's widely known as a brilliant attorney, people will want to hire them and then they will bring in that money. But you can also have people who are terrible lawyers and not brilliant at all, but somehow have the connections to bring in the money. And when they bring in the money, the partners get the money. And then they can pay those, country club fees. I've told you this story already 5 minutes ago. All right. So Mr. Ettinger told Mr. Craig to stress the prospect of further business because that will make a difference. It's the only factor that will matter to the firm's leaders. Describing the Ukraine report as a $1 million a month engagement, which it wasn't, Mr. Craig said Ms. Manafort's connections made up for her unimpressive grades. Aha, now we're really getting somewhere. 5 days later, she had a job offer. "You are the man," her father wrote to Mr. Craig, calling his daughter Sky High. She just kept on eating lobster and pretending nothing was wrong, it seems. At least one Skadden lawyer wondered how Mr. Yanukovych would react if the report was critical. Well, better not be then, right? Mr. Craig reassured him that anything would be better than the condemnation Ukraine already faced. That's a good spin. But while Mr. Craig insisted the report be independent, Mr. Yanukovych's aides were apparently tracking its progress by eavesdropping on phone calls. They were wiretapping their own lawyers, in other words, to make sure that the report was going to come out the way they wanted. After Jonathan Hawker, one of the Western public relations experts hired by Ukraine, worried in a phone call that the report would be too negative, he heard from Konstantin Kilimnik, a Yanukovych aide. Mr. Kilimnik, whom prosecutors have linked to Russian intelligence, was the guy nicknamed the Angry Midget for his short stature and temper. I had no idea that he was short of stature, but Kilimnik is a name we heard all throughout the Manafort trial, right? And wasn't he one of his partners, and wasn't he the one that was constantly scheming with Manafort for ways to make good on their debt to the other oligarch? And now I can't even remember which one it is, but it'll probably come up in the article to remind us. But you recall, is it Deripaska that he owed so much money to and who was going to sue him? And I thought that was the deal. Kilimnik was trying to help Manafort find ways to make good on their debt to Deripaska, and that was why they were offering him private briefings on the polls during the campaign. The president's office was very angry and concerned about what it heard, Mr. Kilimnik warned. That's Yanukovych, not our president. He demanded a memo explaining what Mr. Hawker had meant, which means, of course, that they had heard the conversation. Next up, the rollout. The report was of limited value unless it generated publicity. So the public relations team drafted about 18 versions of a rollout plan. The team expanded to include a supposedly independent European think tank headed by Vin Weber. And those of us who are longtime observers of Washington, D.C., and maybe even listeners to the show, I've called his name once or twice. They describe him here as a former Republican congressman from Minnesota. And Tony Podesta, whose name you've heard as well, of the now-defunct Podesta Group lobbying and public affairs firm. Prosecutors now claim Mr. Yanukovych's political party funded the organization. Yes, it probably did. Vin Weber, since they're not telling you more about him here, was a very close Newt Gingrich ally back in the Republican Revolution days, and a hanger-on in ways. I mean, he was a force of his own. He was a very high-ranking member of Gingrich's cadre, but he didn't stick around all that long post-1994 revolution. There was more money to be made elsewhere, but he was a guy, so here he is heading an independent European think tank. What is he doing there? He's a former American congressman, a European think tank. Anyway, he jumped all over the think tank world and moved from all over the network of nonprofits that Newt Gingrich maintained to launder political donations, essentially. He was very big into the game of forming quote-unquote educational nonprofits because, of course, one, it was easier to hide the money that got donated to those nonprofits because he didn't have to disclose quite as often. And two, he was always playing the game of pushing the envelope of how much political work a nonprofit could do without losing its nonprofit status. And Vin Weber, what you did was you plugged in your people on the board of 6 or 7 of these educational organizations. These nonprofits, put them in 6 or 7 of them. They draw a salary from all of them. So you're making decent private sector money off of supposedly nonprofit organizations, and the donations are tax exempt, and it goes on and on. Vin Weber, I think, got himself in the middle of it all a seat at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, which was like at the hub of Newt Gingrich's Newt Incorporated web of nonprofits. Okay. They didn't do a good job filling you in on all of that. But that's what we do here. We read one of these things and make a whole show about it and talk about all the tangents from it. Okay, we're bumping up against another break here, but you can see how fascinating this is. I think we're getting towards the end of the article. I'll read you another paragraph or two here before we cut out, but I got to get the music queued up. And there it is. Okay, so Vin Weber is in on it. Tony Podesta is on it. The alt-right going crazy. The Republican website saying, Podesta, we can pin this on Democrats after all. Then it seems there's another person involved in this too. In late September 2012, Mr. Hawker laid out the strategy to Mr. Craig, Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates, and another Skadden lawyer, Alex Vanderswan, over lunch at the opulent Harvard Club in Manhattan. And Alex Vanderswan was one of the early convictions in all this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. And you see why this story is so fascinating to me. It's not just the seamy underside of the Washington business and legal community, etc. It's how many connections there are to big stories that we've covered as big political developments. As I was saying just before the break, Alex Vanderswan was one of the first people convicted, as I recall, as a result of the Mueller investigations, right? Or at least things that grew into the Mueller investigations. Did Mueller actually prosecute that case? I can't guarantee that offhand, but that's how I'm, I guess so. But that's how I'm recalling it. But yeah, it's interesting that they don't bother. I mean, on a story about the seamy underside, they don't go into who Alex Vanderswan is. And of course, it's just perfect that it's happening at the Harvard Club. And I don't know, at this point, do I continue on and see if they talk about him, or do I give a discussion of Vanderswan at this point? Maybe at this point I'll jump out. I don't think that they discuss him. Alex Vanderswan, I'm just going to go to Wikipedia for it here by way of organizing the thoughts about him. Vanderswan, a Belgian-born Dutch attorney, formerly with the London branch of New York-based international law firm Skadden Arps. On February 20th, 2018, he pleaded guilty to one count of making a false statement to investigators while answering questions about Russian interference in the U.S. elections. He served 30 days in prison, fined $20,000. After serving a sentence, ironically enough, deported to the Netherlands. That's kind of funny. Let's see. The Ukrainian Ministry of Justice was his firm's client and central to the indictment. In 2017, Skadden Arps refunded $567,000 billed by the firm to the Ukrainian government, even though we know just from this story we've been talking about millions of dollars here. But it wasn't billed to the Ukrainian government. That was paid by someone else. That probably won't get refunded. I don't know if it's in the interests of American justice necessarily to refund millions of dollars to corrupt Ukrainian oligarchs. So I'm not feeling too bad about that. Let's see. Let me just skip down to the point here. In November 2017, van der Zwaan was fired from Skadden Arps for gross misconduct due to the false statements he made to the United States Special Counsel's Office. On July 3rd, 2019, van der Zwaan was struck off the roll of solicitors in England and Wales following a judgment of the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal that he had acted dishonestly by knowingly and intentionally giving the Special Counsel's Office false information. I don't think we heard much about that here. Van der Zwaan, who speaks Russian, by the way, was one of the 8 attorneys who worked on Skadden Arps' 2012 report commissioned by the government of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych via Paul Manafort that defended the prosecution, conviction, and imprisonment of Yanukovych's rival, the country's former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko. By the way, I mean, does that ring any bells for people? I mean, not just the fact that that happened, but just, I mean, in terms of Donald Trump and, well, I'm going to put Hillary Clinton in jail and da-da-da, and we're going to jail my former rival, et cetera, et cetera. But my recollection is, though, that Yulia Tymoshenko was not a sympathetic figure entirely. I guess everyone regrets her political prosecution, but I don't think she was a very, I don't think she was my recollection is that she was not an admirable figure, but maybe I wasn't paying that close attention at the time, and maybe I was simply, who knows, maybe I was influenced by PR efforts paid for by this same circle of people. I don't know. It's going to cause me to go back and reevaluate Yulia Tymoshenko, but it wouldn't surprise me if, a fight in Ukraine at this level between two high-level folks in a country racked by war, for one thing, and corruption at the highest levels, if they were both dirty, disgusting people, I guess we couldn't be too terribly surprised. Anyway, continuing to read here from the Wikipedia entry on van der Zwaan, he worked closely with Greg Craig. I guess this is now updated. I don't know when they put this in, but maybe this is coming from out of this report here or other reporting on this trial. Worked closely with Gregory Craig in preparing the report, assisting with fact-finding and attending meetings in Ukraine. He also served as rule of law consultant to the Ministry of Justice in Ukraine. A 2017 interview with former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, said that Skadden Arps should have been ashamed of the report, calling it a nasty piece of work. Nasty, I don't know, but it rings bells with Trump, and I don't know who this guy is, but former ambassador, 2017 former ambassador means pre-Trump, so whatever. Maybe that's something to take away. In February 2018, Special Counsel Investigation Prosecutor Andrew Weissman stated that as part of Manafort's and Rick Gates' lobbying effort to improve Yanukovych's reputation in the U.S., van der Zwaan took an advance copy of the report in late July or August 2012 without authorization and gave it to a public relations firm working for the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice, with one aim being to get the report published in the New York Times, which is where we're reading this story right now. And in September 2012, gave Gates talking points about the report. Prosecutors also said van der Zwaan deleted emails sought by the Special Counsel's Office, such as emails between him and Manafort associate Konstantin Kilimnik, known as Person A in that indictment, I guess, including one requesting that van der Zwaan use encrypted communications, and one from September 2016, rather than turning him over to Skadden Arps, which was then gathering documents for the Special Counsel. In a November 3rd, 2017 interview with Special Counsel prosecutors and FBI agents, van der Zwaan maintained that his last communication with Gates was an innocuous text in mid-August 2016, and that his last contact with Kilimnik was a 2014 discussion of the latter's family. Prosecutors determined instead that he had discussed the 2012 Skadden Arps report with Gates and Kilimnik in September of that year, 2016, during phone calls that he surreptitiously recorded. How dumb is that? Van der Zwaan acknowledged to the Special Counsel investigators in an interview that Gates had told him of Kilimnik's ties to Main Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, a Russian military intelligence agency. February 2018, he pleads guilty. In his plea, he admitted to the email deletions, lying when he told investigators that he had only a passive role in the rollout of the report. The guilty plea did not include an agreement to cooperate with the Mueller investigation. And then the sentencing. 30 days in prison, supervised release for 2 months, $20,000 fine. Let's see. He lives in London. Now, let's see. Married to Eva Khan, daughter of the Russian billionaire German Khan. How confusing. Co-founder and co-owner of the Alpha Group. Yeah, weren't they the bank that was suspected of having the weird servers in Trump Tower? Boy, there's just too much to follow in all this. German Khan is, by the way, it says here, suing BuzzFeed and the private investigation firm Fusion GPS over BuzzFeed's publication of the Trump-Russia dossier containing information about Trump's ties to Russia. Van der Zwaan has Russian roots and has worked with a number of Russian oligarchs. In addition to Dutch, he speaks fluent English, Russian, and French. So we should sue France. And that's something Macron and Trump just came back from. I don't really suspect that there's anything going on there. But, okay, just because the guy speaks French. Whatever. Lots of people speak French. That's what we learned about Alexander Van der Zwaan from Wikipedia, which may or may not be reliable. Now back to the New York Times, which also made an appearance in his Wikipedia profile there. Back to the New York Times story about Greg Craig's trial. So, this is late September 2012. Hawker lays out this strategy to Craig, Manafort, Gates, and Van der Zwaan, who had leaked the report, presumably, to Hawker in order to give them the heads up to create this strategy. This happens at the opulent Harvard Club in Manhattan because only worthy elites have lunch there. Privately, Mr. Hawker found the whole project distasteful. He and Jared and Ivanka, I guess. He ironically nicknamed it Veritas, Latin for truth, and, it prominently displayed on the coat of arms of Harvard, in whose club they were eating, so whatever. You could mention that as well. During weeks holed up in the basement of the Kiev building where Ukraine's prosecutors worked, he, Hawker, I guess, had learned they were readying new charges against Ms. Timoshenko, including buying the wrong ambulances, tax evasion, and murder. For his part, Mr. Craig had grown increasingly worried that Mr. Yanukovych would ignore the report's mixed conclusions and declare that Skadden had exonerated his government. Does that sound familiar? That would be damaging, quote, to the project, to this law firm, to your guy, and to me, he wrote to Mr. Manafort. But of course, I'm sure Mr. Manafort was hearing none of it. We're going to claim that the Mueller report exonerates Trump. So what the hell? I sometimes wonder whether the New York Times writers are being subtle geniuses or really do miss the connections, or do they think like, well, at the New York Times, we don't have to punch you in the face with the connections. We simply make these references and smart readers get it, or whether they really aren't. I really don't know sometimes. The media strategy envisioned releasing the report in advance to chosen American and European news outlets whose coverage would set the tone for others. Witnesses testified that Mr. Craig wanted to give an advance copy to David E. Sanger, a New York Times reporter in Washington. Again, the New York Times. And as we heard in the in the Wikipedia discussion of Van der Zwaan, I guess that must be what they were referring to. But Mr. Craig kept changing his mind about whether he could be directly involved. Under the Foreign Lobbying Disclosure Law, if he engaged in public relations for Ukraine in the United States, he would have to register as a foreign agent. And I guess that's troublesome paperwork, or maybe affects his money-making ability, or perhaps his reputation, which is to say his money-making ability. The article is, at this point, illustrated with a picture of Yulia Tymoshenko in 2011 during her trial. And there she is with the famous long braided hairdo here, wrapped around her head, Middle European style. Anyway, Craig also had well-founded concerns about the professionalism of the public relations team. On the witness stand, Mr. Hawker acknowledged that he doctored Mr. Craig's quotes to one publication without his permission, and also lied to a Radio Free Europe reporter, denying that he represented Ukraine's government. But hey, is Radio Free Europe some kind of high tribunal, one might ask? Mr. Hawker warned Mr. Manafort that the strategy would fall apart without Mr. Craig, who eventually agreed to participate for two reasons: to please his foreign paymasters, and to protect his reputation, Mr. Gates told the FBI. Okay, well, Gates would put it in those terms. 2 days before the report was released, Mr. Craig hand-delivered a copy to Mr. Sanger's home, then granted interviews to reporters from the Times and the Daily Telegraph in London. He insisted to both that Skadden had never looked at whether Ms. Timoshenko's trial was politically motivated. Although the Times article turned out more skeptical than Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates, and Mr. Hawker had hoped, it's linked in this, all three proclaimed the strategy a great success. The news coverage caught the attention of the Justice Department, our own, I guess, but Mr. Craig, concerned about protecting his career prospects, convinced officials there that he did not need to register as a foreign agent. In a letter to the department, he insisted, erroneously, really, or just falsely, that he had responded to journalists' inquiries only after the report was published to correct mischaracterizations. Well, that's just falsely, then. He had acknowledged, or rather, had he acknowledged that Skadden was involved in Ukraine's media plan, the need for him to register as a foreign agent would have been a slam dunk. The federal official in charge of enforcing the foreign lobbying statute told the FBI, according to a summary of her interview. The official, Heather Hunt, testified Monday that Mr. Craig told her that he had spoken to journalists on his own, not at the Ukrainian government's request or direction. 4 years passed before federal prosecutors questioned Mr. Craig again. By then, they were deep into an inquiry into the financial misdeeds of Mr. Manafort, a sprawling investigation that led to the prosecutions of Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates, Mr. van der Zwaan, Mr. Kalimnik, and eventually Mr. Craig. So there it is. Oh, the creak of the chair here. As I lean back in satisfaction at having made it all the way through this piece, and I guess it's literally in the last line that they even acknowledge that van der Zwaan was in trouble. And so there's some related coverage here it's interesting. I mean, I mostly skipped the Greg Craig portion of this story along the way, but it's certainly gotten some significant coverage here in the New York Times in late 2000. Stretching back as far as February 2018. How Skadden, the giant law firm, got entangled in the Mueller investigation. Then an August 2018 piece, The Rise and Fall of Paul Manafort, Greed, Deception, and Ego. And finally, linked here, August 11th of this year, Prominent Lawyer's Trial Will Test Crackdown on Unregistered Foreign Agents. But based on the headlines alone, I would think this is the most interesting of the four. But I'm just curious now, just following my own, my own train of thought here. And sometimes I am convinced that it is that train of thought that makes the show interesting. But I wanted to click on the Yulia Tymoshenko link in the Alex van der Zwaan Wikipedia summary and read a little bit about her and figure out what's going on. Here she is with a different hairstyle, by the way. And the braided thing, which she wraps around the back of her head, makes her look older than this picture. I don't know when this picture is from, but the picture that comes up when you scroll over Yulia Tymoshenko's name in Wikipedia has her looking more international fashion model-y, without the hair braided, and with a pair of glasses on to make her look like an intellectual type, and a high black turtleneck and a fashionable jacket here. I'm curious about finding out more about her and whether I remember her correctly or not. I'm just, or whether I may have been guided to the wrong conclusion by a PR campaign against her or what. Yulia Tymoshenko, forget about trying to read her middle name here. She's the leader of the All-Ukrainian Union Fatherland National Party, which rings alarm bells. My recollection was that she was not super clean on the proto-fascist anti-Semitism type stuff at the time, but that she was being tried not for that, but for other various corruptions by an equally or more corrupt Yanukovych government, and that there were no winners in all this. She supports Ukraine's integration into the European Union, and strongly opposes the membership of Ukraine in the Russian-led Eurasian Customs Union. She supports NATO membership for Ukraine as well. Tymoshenko co-led the Orange Revolution. Orange has since seen its stock dive, by the way, thanks to Trump, but was the first woman appointed Prime Minister of Ukraine, serving from January 24th to September 8th, 2005, and again from December 18th, 2007 to March 4th, 2010. Okay. She placed third in Forbes magazine's list of the world's most powerful women in 2005. How interesting. So the third most powerful woman, I guess, in the world in 2005, and then jail. It happens. She finished second in the Ukrainian presidential election of 2010 runoff, losing by 3.5 percentage points to the winner, Viktor Yanukovych, who then put her in jail. After being a heavy favorite in the polls for several years, she came in third in the first round of the 2019 Ukrainian presidential election, and this would be like after the trial. And I don't know whether she went to jail or not. I thought it said in the other one that she did. Let me just quickly glance over the table of contents here and see if there's anything that can point to why she was such a controversial figure and whether she's worthy of sympathy and all this, all these machinations or not. Yeah, 2011 trial and imprisonment and other criminal cases against Tymoshenko. So she did do some time. She was released in prison from prison in 2014. Political activities after release, parliamentary activity from 2014 to 2018, the 2019 presidential election. Very interesting. Yeah, that's going to require some offline study. I don't think I am seeing the source of the controversy, which leads me to wonder whether she was, in fact, framed up in all of this. She certainly would have. It's clear from all the photos that they've chosen over here that she was attracting a lot of attention, or she was charismatic, was another way of putting the idea that she was photogenic and attractive, and so therefore something, and whether that contributed to her rise in popularity or generated the ill will of the other side, or I don't know what. Maybe for all I know, given the way things go in the world and what we discover about people who are otherwise supposed to be regarded as serious figures in world politics, maybe Yanukovych propositioned her and was rejected, and so therefore she had to go to jail. Could be. You never know. No indication of that here in the discussion, though, on the Wikipedia page. But who knows? It's a very dense page, and I haven't read it all. But yeah, I'm going to say there's probably some interesting facts to be distilled from this. If you, listening to the show, happen to be an expert in Ukraine politics and can help us sort through any of this or point to any published articles that might help further our understanding of this thing, please, by all means, send them on to us. Okay. I didn't think that this was going to take up all day, but it did. But I think it was kind of worth it. Interesting to watch some of the pieces that are moving behind the scenes out there. Okay. Let's see. Where to go next? There's, pardon me, I had to mute things here. It's getting very froggy in here. I thought this might make some interesting reading. The G Summit now having ended, and in embarrassing fashion, I think, at the end of all this, with Trump insisting that he was ready to hold the G7 summit next year, scheduled to happen inside the United States, that his team was somehow miraculously settling on one of his resorts, Doral Resort in Florida, as an appropriate venue for the next G7 meeting. Not Mar-a-Lago, curiously enough. And I don't know whether that's because he thought that that would be too obvious, or that it didn't, in fact, enjoy some of the logistical advantages that he claimed in his pitch for the venue yesterday that Doral had. But it's also pointed out that Doral is not doing well financially, and this would be a big boost for them. But if all the money ends up in Donald Trump's pocket, do you think it matters to him which one he launders it through? I'm not sure. Anyway, as it turns out, apparently Doral has some pretty serious problems, including one, vermin infestations. But apparently Trump wants you to know it's closer to the airport probably than Mar-a-Lago, as they may have the capacity to have all the dignitaries stay there. I don't know if that's something that they're going to want to do. And in fact, I would advise that they not stay in Doral. I mean, presumably wherever they stay, it would be good practice to assume that the place is bugged and be sure that you don't discuss any classified information that your country and the national security of your nation would be cause you to be concerned about. But I think it's a different matter entirely if you have, say, the meeting at Doral, where Trump is known to have wired the place for video and sound for his own enjoyment in surveillance, just like at Mar-a-Lago when he would listen into the phone conversations of guests. There's extensive reporting, mostly in BuzzFeed, I think, about his penchant for wiring his properties for sound and video, and bragging from time to time about how he used it to keep tabs on politicians and to keep dirt on politicians. He has a penchant for that, apparently, according to BuzzFeed's reporting, and maybe I can include some of those things. Oh, I did. As a matter of fact, I included them in the Morning Post, revving up to today's show, about how he likes to do that. And so I would recommend that, in addition to worrying about official American intelligence and counterintelligence bugging of any facility where foreign leaders are going to be staying, you would, it just compounds the problem if the private host has their own surveillance system and the private host is also the President of the United States. Many reasons to avoid staying at Doral, even if you're forced to have the conference there. And then, of course, by the way, I was talking with Greg about this yesterday, that I would assume that Trump would go ahead and invite Putin. And Greg thought that that was a dangerous move because the conference happens in close proximity to the election. And lots of people thought that that was a sensible objection, which is why Trump has blown right past it. And in fact, at this point, has openly said that he intends to invite Putin to come, not to mention spending the rest of the day talking about how Russia belonged back in the G7, so to bring it up to the G8 again, and his impassioned defense of Putin and Russia's claims to being rightly included in all of this has garnered a lot of attention. So I have here Jonathan Chait's piece, though we may or may not be huge fans of this particular Jonathan, for the New York Magazine, the New York Magazine, I like to call it, because I just made that up. Trump went to the mat for Putin at the G7 summit. We could read a little bit about how strange and suspicious his defense, his continued defense, his lickspittle defense for Putin really is. And, as an opening paragraph here, 5 years ago, Russia invaded neighboring Ukraine, remember them, and stole a chunk of its territory, the first redrawing of an international border since World War II. As punishment, Russia was expelled from the G8, a blow to Vladimir Putin's prestige. Trump spent this year's G7 summit, as he had the previous one, pleading for the Russian dictator to be readmitted. How strange. We'll be right back after this break. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. And let's jump right back into the piece by Jonathan Chait here. Trump went to the mat for Putin at the G7 summit. We know that he did that, and we know that he spent the last G7 summit saying Russia should be there too. In a press conference, Trump testified that before his capricious expulsion, Putin was a loved and valued member of the elite group. I heard he was a great member of the G8. People feel very much like me, many people. He lamented the meetings weren't much use without Putin getting to participate. We had a lot of things that we were discussing, and it would have been very easy if Russia was in the room. If he was in the room, we could have solved those things. I guess he didn't know how to solve them, and Putin could have told him how to solve them, and he could have nodded along, I suppose. And Trump expressed confidence that Russia would accept an invitation to return. I know one thing. If they were invited back, I think they'd be there. Which is why Trump's way of saying Putin told him he would like to rejoin the group. Putin and Trump have spoken repeatedly in secretive circumstances, and that's a linked assertion, so you know it's got to be true. And we all believe it anyway. Concealing the contents of his discussions even from his own government, which is an amazing thing. But what about Putin's invasion? The reason he was kicked out in the first place. Trump bizarrely presented this as Barack Obama's fault. Of course, because everything's Barack Obama's fault. Crimea was sort of taken away from President Obama. Not taken away from President Trump, taken away from President Obama. President Obama was not happy that this happened because it was embarrassing to him. Right? It was very embarrassing to him, and he wanted Russia to be out of what was called the G8. And that was his determination. He was outsmarted by Putin. He was outsmarted. President Putin outsmarted President Obama. What's the outsmarting? He invaded Crimea, and Obama didn't nuke them. I mean, I guess that's outsmarting. Trump mentioned Obama 18 times, Chait says, repeating his charge that his predecessor was to blame for Russia's invasion of his neighbor. He repeatedly used the passive voice to describe Putin's invasion. It was sort of taken away from President Obama. It was annexed during President Obama's term. Crimea was annexed during his term. Putin got no blame for invading a neighbor. Instead, Trump gave him credit for outsmarting Obama. Just how Putin outsmarted Obama, Trump did not say. When a big country invades a smaller neighbor, the only certain way to reverse the invasion is to go to war. Obviously, Trump is not saying Obama should have invaded Russia. Short of going to war, the only options for stopping a military invasion are to impose diplomatic pressure, such as expelling Russia from the G8, and economic pressure, such as sanctions. Of course, Trump had set out to reverse those punishments, making his attempt to shift blame to Obama especially Orwellian. Obama is the one who imposed consequences for Russia's invasion that might at least discourage further encroachments. Trump is the one working to undo those punishments, Mr. Law and Order, right? allowing Putin to reap the rewards of the invasion at no cost and possibly to grab more territory if he desires. It is completely Orwellian spectacle. The president trying to reward Russia's attack is blaming the president who punished the attacks for the invasion itself. It is possible Trump is using this bizarre argument to sell his base on his Russophilic policy, using Obama as a boogeyman allows him to distract from the fact that he's acting as a sidekick to a foreign enemy. It's treason, in other words, is what he's saying here, but he doesn't like to use that word. It's also possible Putin presented this argument to Trump, and maybe even re-presented it at some later date, who harbors his own obsessive hatred and envy for Obama and actually believes it. Remarkably, Trump's performance behind closed doors managed to go even farther in pleading Putin's case. Trump's extraordinary promotion of Putin proved to be the most tense disagreement, reports the Washington Post, which adds that Trump's fervent advocacy for Putin was coolly received by other leaders at this gathering, and that the meeting went off the rails when Trump blasted leaders for not including Russia. Sources from inside the meeting tell the Post Trump's presence was tantamount to having Putin himself in the room. And I guess the way they put it is quoted here. But having such a forceful advocate for an authoritarian leader inside the room of democracies profoundly shaped the overall tone of the summit. One senior official said, "The consequence is the same as if one of the participants is a dictator," the official said. No community of like-minded leaders who are pulling together. I see. Robert Mueller failed to establish a criminal conspiracy between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia, thanks in part to the refusal of Paul Manafort and Roger Stone to cooperate with him. He never delved into the counterintelligence question of just how deep and compromising Trump's ties to Russia run. Whatever the answer, it remains plain that Trump is deeply committed to advocating for the man who helped him get elected. For whatever strange reason. Okay, even if he didn't help him get elected, he's still somehow just really, really dedicated to pleading Putin's case wherever it happens. Let's see. There was something else that this reminded me of up here. And what was the thought that I had when I was reading this part about, all right, when a big country invades a smaller neighbor, the only certain way to reverse the invasion is to go to war. Obviously, Trump is not saying Obama should have invaded Russia. Short of going to war, the only options were diplomatic pressure, such as expelling Russia from the G8, and economic pressure, such as sanctions, right? Both of which he's trying to reverse. And, by the way, which was the subject of the discussion in Trump Tower. They tried to disguise that by saying, remember when they said it was about Russian adoptions, and then it didn't turn out to... They thought that they were getting dirt on Hillary Clinton, but then they instead spoke about Russian adoptions. But it was too easy, really, to conclude that Russian adoptions was a topic because the Russian adoption pipeline had been stopped as retaliation for the sanctions imposed on Russia by Obama as punishment for the annexation, the invasion of Ukraine. Right? So that Russian adoption was a euphemism for sanctions. We want to get the adoptions back on track, but remember that adoptions are being blocked because of the sanctions. In other words, this is our, code word for asking that the sanctions be lifted. That's what the Trump Tower meeting was about. And since then, Trump has done everything he can to reverse those sanctions and to reverse the decision of other countries to sanction Russia as well. And so I guess he blows up the G7. And, So somebody had asked, I think Plutonium Page had asked the other day, is it possible for them to expel the United States from the G7? And I guess, it's a good question. I don't know who's responsible for determining the makeup of the G7. And I guess the other 6 entities can simply agree to meet on their own, but I don't know whether they think it's in their diplomatic best interest and geopolitical best interest to do so. But there's clearly no point in continuing to meet with Donald Trump about anything. but maybe this is part of the normalcy they want to try to maintain. But I guess they could just decide, yeah, we'll meet amongst ourselves. It's not clear that Japan would go along with it. Their prime minister, did we decide that we're supposed to call him Abe Shinzo? Is that right? Anyway, he's got his own reasons for playing along with Trump, and it's not entirely clear that there's anything nefarious about it. They just want to have a decent, they want to get what they want to get out of the United States. They might not be inclined, just simply by the fact that they're not a European country, to stick together in some sort of European solidarity. All the rest of the entities of the G7 are European. Japan and the United States are the only outliers there. So I don't know. I'm not certain whether they would play along or not. But anyway, I just found the whole thing sort of interesting, and an easy way of dancing around the fact. I mean, Chait is pretty direct in all this, but I gather that he's avoiding just simply outright pointing out that this is providing aid and comfort to the enemy here. And a lot of people argue when we're talking about actual formal, like treason type charges. Well, you can't really say it's treason because we're not at war. And Russia isn't necessarily an enemy since we're not in a state of war. And that's what the founders meant by waging war against the United States. But there's also the giving aid and comfort here or elsewhere to enemies. It's just, I guess it all hinges on enemies. But Chait is willing to say enemy. We all really should be willing to say enemies here. And the fact that he's giving them free reign here in Ukraine, I mean, that's a really remarkable thing. I'm remembering now, thinking about the secretly recorded discussion among the Republican House leadership back in, 2016, having met with the Ukrainian government's delegation and coming to the conclusion that the Russians were playing this diabolical game and subverting free elections in Eastern Europe and attempting to expand that influence to Western Europe and probably into the United States as well. And then McCarthy's conclusion that Trump was paid by Putin, and how all of these doubts somehow are erased when he hands them additional power by winning the election. That was kind of a strange thing. But the fact that Ukraine is the center of the discussion there is relevant. The fact that we read in the previous discussion about Gregory Craig's trial that Ukraine was in the middle of prosecuting Timoshenko, whose goal, for whatever reason it was, to integrate the Ukraine, just regular Ukraine, into the Western community, to make them a part of the European Union and to join NATO, etc. All of this should be read into, one, the fact that Trump isn't interested in defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which, I guess he gets away with it on a technicality in terms of the treason question and whether or not Russia is an enemy, because Ukraine never got the chance to join NATO and the European Union. They were undermined, invaded, and saw the advocate of those moves jailed instead, although she's out now and apparently free to run. And Yushchenko, I guess, is out and in exile in Russia, of all places, along with Snow. So, that's kind of weird, too. I wonder if he regrets that. Anyway, I find it difficult to miss the Snowden. I'm thinking of like Jon Snow from, he's not the one in exile in Russia. It's Edward Snowden, who's in Russia, and probably thought that was a wise place to escape to at the time, and in hindsight, maybe thinks differently of it, but I don't know. Too late for him to change his mind about that one. I guess he's never getting out of there. Anyway, I just found it interesting that if you're having difficulty coming to the conclusion that Russia's an enemy and that Trump is therefore a traitor who belongs on trial for his life, think about how close Ukraine came to joining NATO. Now, had they been admitted to the European Union and NATO and been invaded by Russia, I don't know that the response is necessarily different, and that would have sorely tested the value of NATO. And in a weird backhanded way, I guess if you were looking to justify Trump's positions on NATO and the European Union, for that matter, with backfill, like along the lines of "kov fefe" is a real word, and we really should buy Greenland, and Doral is a brilliant place to put this, and yada yada, and all the other various things that happened in the last couple of days that are of a piece with this. I guess you could say, well, it's on technical grounds. They never did join the European Union. They never did join NATO. But if they had, we would have been bound by treaty to go to war with Russia. But no one really believes that we would have done so. And so therefore, maybe NATO and the European Union, it's not really the role of the European Union for the United States to jump in mutual defense, but certainly NATO. But would European Union nations have done so in mutual defense of a brand new member state, one that really had no traditional ties to Western Europe, at the risk of outright war in Europe with the Russians? If they would have shied away, then maybe NATO is a worthless organization after all, or at least in certain circumstances, and I'm sure that he would have used that to justify his position on all that, but he'd be, generally speaking, wrong. In general, it's a valuable alliance and has maintained the peace in Europe for many years. But I guess it could all go out the window over this. And, what would you have said, though, about a president who not only declined to live up to NATO treaty obligations, but did so by saying, NATO has always been worthless and we want out and they should just fold and we should, get out of the way of Russia at all costs? I think the charge of treason would have been a lot clearer there. So it's good news, legally speaking, for Trump. Not that anyone ever will hold him to account. And even in return to normalcy, would we ever hold Trump to account? I mean, the big complaint about the Obama administration was that they wouldn't hold the previous Republican crazy a-hole to account either. So is it likely we would make the same mistake twice? Ordinarily, we say no, but I think we'd be willing to say, yeah, probably do the same thing. Yeah, I think we would make the same mistake twice. Sure. Absolutely. We have every chance of doing so. You can hope for better in the next election, but will it matter? I guess that brings us to one more story that I think we ought to cover before cutting out for the day. It's been kind of we haven't gotten to all the stories that we really need to, but here's one that will fit in because we've already made the transition to it. From the Center for Public Integrity comes this piece published yesterday: Federal Election Commission to effectively shut down. Now what? Good question. Dave Leventhal reports this one. Federal Election Commission Vice Chairman Matthew Peterson announced his resignation today. That would have been yesterday. This means the agency that enforces and regulates the nation's campaign finance laws will effectively shut down. Something that hasn't happened since 2008. Yes, it's happened before. Because it won't have the legal minimum of 4 commissioners to make high-level decisions. Peterson's resignation, first reported by the Washington Examiner, curiously enough, will throw the FEC into turmoil for weeks and perhaps months as the nation enters the teeth of the 2020 presidential and congressional elections. For now, the FEC can't conduct meetings. It can't slap political scofflaws with fines. Not that it ever made a difference when they did. It can't make rules. It can't conduct audits and approve them. It can't vote on the outcome of investigations. And while staff will continue to post campaign finance reports and attend to day-to-day functions, the commission itself can't offer official advice to politicians and political committees who seek it. Despite the lack of quorum, I expect to be fully occupied while at the commission, reviewing case files and preparing for new members to join the commission, said FEC Commissioner Caroline Hunter, a Republican, who described Peterson as a, quote, true gentleman scholar. Hunter added that the agency's various divisions will still be on the job, answering questions, litigating cases, maintaining our website, conducting ongoing audits, and processing complaints, disclosure reports, and other filings. FEC Chairwoman Ellen Weintraub, a Democrat, did not address the FEC's loss of a quorum in a statement to the Center for Public Integrity, instead echoing Hunter's praise of Peterson. So fine. By the way, praising him by saying, for 11 years, Peterson has been a gracious and steady colleague on the commission. Now an update to the story. In a follow-up statement, Weintraub vowed that the FEC would attend to its duties to the best of its ability despite losing a quorum of commissioners. The FEC will still be able to shine a strong spotlight on the finances of the 2020 campaign. They just can't prosecute you for violating them. Throughout my service, I have faithfully discharged my duty to enforce the law in a manner that respects free speech rights while also fairly interpreting relevant statutes. This is the departing statement of Peterson in his letter to Donald Trump relaying his resignation. It's really not the main story. Trump, in September of 2017, nominated Peterson to a federal district judgeship, but Peterson withdrew in December of 2017 after a disastrous confirmation hearing and has remained at the FEC until now. What was the disaster about, you might wonder? It's linked, so you can read about it. Salt Lake Tribune reporting this one. Judicial nominee with Utah ties withdraws after fumbling questions at his confirmation. Interesting enough. I don't recall offhand what those fumbles were about, but interesting. Let's see. When's the last time you read the rules of civil procedure? He was asked. Well, I don't know. Probably law school, I guess. I don't know exactly what he said, but apparently he didn't give very impressive answers. And that bothered Republicans enough that he ended up withdrawing. So anyway, more important, I think, to this story is this second section here, which is entitled A Long Time Coming. This is a de facto FEC shutdown more than 2 years in the making, and something for which commissioners have long been girding. The FEC has operated with the bare minimum of 4 commissioners for the past year and a half. Democrat Ann Ravel, or I'm not certain how she pronounces it, resigned in March of 2017, and Republican Lee Goodman resigned in February of 2018. The 4 remaining commissioners have together served more than 37 years past the expiration of their 6-year terms. That's because federal law allows FEC commissioners to continue serving in holdover status until the president nominates and the Senate confirms someone to replace them. And we know how that game goes. Consider the case of Ellen Weintraub, whose term expired in 2007. Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump each failed to nominate someone to replace her. So Weintraub has continued to serve. She is still joined on the FEC by remaining commissioners Hunter and independent Stephen Walther. No more than 3 FEC commissioners may identify with any one political party, and the President of the United States alone has the power to nominate commissioners to the 6-member FEC. Trump has so far made a single nomination, Trey Traynor, a Trump-supporting Texas attorney and Republican. Trump first nominated Traynor to the FEC in September of 2017, and since then, he has twice renominated Traynor after the U.S. Senate failed to grant Traynor a confirmation hearing, the Republican Senate. The U.S. Senate has yet to take action on Traynor's nomination. He would fill the Peterson seat, the seat Peterson says he'll vacate on August 31st. The U.S. Senate has long observed a tradition in which the president nominates FEC commissioners in pairs, one Republican, one Democrat. One reason Traynor's nomination may have stalled. The White House has repeatedly declined to answer questions about the FEC, which for years has been marked by internal discord and deadlocks, and that's linked to, and that tells you the story, the background story, which brings us to when the FEC is evenly divided, they simply negate one another. Republicans vote no on investigating Republicans. Democrats vote no on investigating Democrats. Tie vote, no investigation. Been happening for a long time. While FEC commissioners often toil in relative anonymity, a few achieve high profiles. Former Republican FEC Chairman Trevor Potter, for example. Everyone knows him, right? Well, he served as Senator John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign general counsel, then made regular appearances earlier this month with comedian Stephen Colbert, who had a long-running gag about super PACs and secret political money. Another former FEC chairman, Don McGahn, him you know, right, became his 2016 general counsel. And after Trump won the election, McGahn, long an advocate of a weak FEC and campaign finance deregulation in general, served until late 2018 as Trump's White House counsel. So that's where it stands. There's more to be read into the situation, but now heading into a presidential year with a candidate who appears to have, quote-unquote, won election the first time around with a massive cheating scandal, essentially, looming in the background, and Republican acknowledgement of Russian interference in Western democracies at a maniacal level. We now face a rerun of the 2016 election, only worse, with more at stake and more to cover up and more leverage with which to do it, and with no FEC around to help with the task of enforcing federal election law. But honestly, the FEC isn't the organization that's capable of standing up to what's happening here with Russian interference. The FEC was never going to... The FEC can barely control things when it's technical violations entirely perpetrated by American candidates. So very little hope that they would be able to intervene on an international situation in any way that would be likely to help the situation. But anyway, as you know, this is a political fight. Trump, I'm sure, is going to be unwilling to nominate any Democrats at all. I don't know why the Republican Senate was reluctant to go forward with, and maybe they will now after August 31st, with a nomination of another Republican only to the commission. Forget what tradition says. I'm sure they would like to leverage every bit of power that they can. That seems to be right up McConnell's alley. But as you know, these sorts of controversies are not grounds for impeachment. You're best served by settling at the ballot box. Settle it at the ballot box, people, through free and fair elections, of which we have no one around to enforce the integrity of. So just roll the dice and assume everything will be normal, right? I mean, I guess there's really no other way of dealing with it. All right. That about wraps it up in terms of things we have time to actually cover, but I will tease one more story. Perhaps we can read it more thoroughly in days to come later this week, but I wanted to put this on the map for you. A foreign policy article asking the question in its headline, is Russia's doomsday missile fake news? You remember the big explosion that we still haven't really got a explanation for and we're still worried about. By the way, apparently Russia has even more plans for doing crazy things with experimental nuclear reactors, which isn't going to please a lot of you. But I thought this was an interesting story. Experts are skeptical that Moscow has the money or technical know-how to field Putin's promised arsenal. So then what was that thing that exploded? Are they saying they weren't capable even of producing the prototype that was said to have exploded? I don't really know. And if that is the case, what the hell was it that exploded and sent a plume of radiation out there over the White Sea? So maybe we'll find out at some later date. We're not going to have time to read through this article, but I just wanted to sort of put it out there as another thing to think about, along with all this other interesting stuff that we read through today. So I think we only made it through 3 or 4 articles in all of this. I wasn't expecting to spend all that time on the Gregory Craig trial, but it seemed like an interesting hub around which a lot of our favorite stories were revolving today. Plus, it gave us a chance to lament the state of things among our ruling elite and wonder whether we're ever going to get out from under the thumb of our own web of corruption and mess that we suffer from here in the United States as we scoff and look askance at Ukraine in dealing with their own corruption. Maybe we have problems enough of our own. Anyway, time now to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and why I'm fumbling for things to say. I have no idea when there are prepared statements to read to you about what's coming up on his show. For instance, despite providing proof of citizenship, Louisiana officials refused to release an American citizen based on his ethnicity so they could turn him over to ICE, because the cruelty is the point, I guess. The Kentucky GOP is wasting thousands of taxpayer dollars to build a wall in the State House so they don't have to sit near Democrats. What? Okay, explain that one. A bland announcement in the Federal Register marks the beginning of the end of the Fed's 50-year reefer madness crusade as well.
From Daily Co's
Why do I want to say cocaine?
On NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Justice will have more about the lack of a functioning Federal Election Commission for you as well. And in international news, a Chinese-born Australian writer held in China since January has been formally arrested on espionage charges, and Amnesty International named 5 new political prisoners in Cuba. Do not congratulate.